The record for New Orleans Police Department case No. 4932 begins not with a body, but with a physical aperture. At 4:45 a.m. on May 23, 1980, Jake Maggio and Andrew Maggio, residing at the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets, made a discovery that would initiate a 3-year sequence of forensic anomalies. According to the initial responding officer's notes, the physical environment of the Maggio residence remained largely undisturbed. With one distinct exception, the rear door was a standard wooden construction, common to the uptown grocer residences of the era. The report describes a lower panel, approximately 12 by 16 inches, which had been removed from the frame. The tool marks around the edges of the void were consistent with a heavy-gauge chisel. The panel itself was not shattered. It had been extracted with enough precision to be laid intact upon the porch floorboards. The gap created was sufficient for a human arm to reach through and turn the interior bolt. The interior of the Maggio apartment was silent when the brothers entered their brother Joseph's bedroom. Joseph Maggio and his wife, Catherine, were discovered in their bed. The coroner's report, filed later that afternoon, notes that Joseph's skull had been fractured in multiple places with a heavy, blunt object. His throat had been severed with a straight razor. Catherine Maggio's injuries mirrored these: a crushed cranium and a deep cervical laceration. There is a specific detail in the inventory of the bedroom that deviates from standard robbery-homicide patterns. On the dresser sat a stack of currency and several pieces of jewelry. The drawer of the knitstand remained closed. The responding officers noted that nothing of monetary value had been removed from the premises. The only item missing from its habitual place was an axe, which Joseph Maggio kept in the woodpile behind the house. The axe was recovered later that morning. It was found leaning against the rear wall of the residence, beneath the void in the door. The blade was coated in a dark, viscous substance that the lab later confirmed to be human blood and brain matter. It had been wiped, albeit incompletely, with a piece of cloth found nearby. The investigation then moved to the exterior perimeter. 20 feet from the rear porch, in the tall grass of the neighboring lot, a second weapon was recovered, the straight razor. The handle was bone white. Upon inspection, the police determined the razor belonged to Andrew Maggio. He was a barber by trade. The ledger of his shop, located several blocks away, indicated that the razor had been removed from his kit sometime during the previous evening. Under interrogation, as recorded in the precinct supplemental file, Andrew Maggio stated he had returned home late and had not heard the sound of the chisel or the removal of the door panel. The walls of the residence were thin. The brothers slept in the adjacent room. The lack of auditory evidence, the absence of a struggle or a scream is a recurring entry in the 1918 files. Outside, on the sidewalk of Upper Line Street, a patrolman discovered a message. It was written in white chalk on the pavement, near the entrance to the grocery store that occupied the front of the Maggio building. The script was described as crude but legible. It read, "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony." The Mrs. Tony referenced in the chalk script created a vacuum in the police records. A search of the city's mortality registers for the preceding months yielded no Mrs. Tony killed in a similar fashion. The name did not appear in the active missing persons files or the hospital intake logs. The implication in the record was clear. The writer was referencing an event that the authorities had either failed to categorize correctly or had not yet discovered. The Maggio file concludes its first entry with a list of forensic failures. Fingerprints were sought from the smooth surface of the chiseled door panel, but the grain of the wood and the humidity of the May morning had blurred any potential ridges into illegible smudges. The neighbors, when canvassed, reported only the usual sounds of the pre-dawn city, the distant whistle of the docks and the rattling of the milk carts. No one reported the sound of wood being pried from a frame. The final note in the May 23rd log mentions a single silver shilling found on the floor of the grocery store, near the internal door leading to the living quarters. It was not part of the store's till. It sat alone on the floorboards, an object of foreign currency in a room where the local registers were left untouched before the Archival news. This record was briefly withheld for classification. Viewers who wish to follow future releases may subscribe. Asterisk. The archival records for the summer of 1918 transition from a single homicide investigation into a study of mechanical patterns. Following the Maggio interment, the New Orleans Police Department began a systematic review of all structural breaches in the metropolitan area. The focus was not on the severity of thief crimes, but on the aperture of entry. The logic of Chisel refers to a specific, repeatable procedure of ingress that appears in the files of 3 separate residences between June and August. On the morning of June 8, 1918, a new entry was added to the ledger. Louis Besumer, a grocer at the corner of Dorgenois and La Harpe Streets, was discovered alongside an associate, Harriet Lowe. The scene, as documented by the responding sergeant, mirrored the Maggio residence in its architectural manipulation. A panel had been removed from the rear door of the grocery store. The dimensions recorded in the field notes were nearly identical, approximately 13 inches by 15 inches. The chisel marks on the Besumer door were analyzed for the pressure of the strike. The wood fibers were crushed inward, suggesting a heavy-gauge tool, likely a 1-inch carpenter's chisel. The panel had been extracted and placed with a deliberate lack of force against the side of the house. Inside the bedroom, the intruder had used an axe. The record notes that this axe belonged to Besumer himself. It had been taken from his own backyard and returned to the scene of the attack after use. The medical examiner's report for Harriet Lowe describes a deep cleft in the left side of the skull. Despite the force of the blow, Lowe remained conscious for several days. Her depositions, however, introduced a systemic complication into the file. According to the June 11th entry, Lowe claimed Besumer himself was a German agent and had orchestrated the attack. The police inventory of Besumer's private quarters found no evidence of espionage, but they did find a collection of letters written in German, which were seized and translated. The translation, preserved in the appendix of the case file, revealed only mundane correspondence regarding the grocery trade and family matters in Europe. The Besumer file contains a notable omission. Unlike the Maggio case, there was no chalk message on the pavement. However, the forensic inventory of the bedroom noted a similar lack of theft. A trunk containing several $100s in cash sat at the foot of the bed. It remained locked. The intruder had bypassed the currency to reach for the axe on August 5, 1918. The file expands to include the residence of Edward Schneider on Elmira Street. Schneider, returning from work late in the evening, discovered his wife, Anna, slumped in the doorway of their bedroom. She had been struck in the face with a blunt instrument, resulting in the loss of several teeth and a fractured jaw. The responding officers bypassed the victim to inspect the rear entrance. The record states, rear door panel removed by means of a chisel. Panel found on the kitchen floor. In this instance, the intruder's tool of choice was a hatchet found in the Schneider's own shed. The hatchet was recovered from the kitchen sink, where it had been rinsed with water. though traces of iron-scented residue remained in the drain trap. The Schneider entry is the first to include a physical description of a potential suspect. Two neighbors, questioned at 2:15 a.m., claimed to have seen a tall, shadowy figure moving through the alleyway behind Elmira Street. The witness statements described the figure as wearing a dark suit and a slouch hat, carrying what appeared to be a leather tool roll. When the police searched the alley, they found no footprints in the dry dust, but they did recover a single item, a weathered chisel with a chipped wooden handle. The department's mechanical analysis of these three cases Maggio, Besumer, and Schneider revealed a troubling logistical consistency. In each case, the intruder did not bring a primary weapon to the scene. The records indicate a reliance on the found object. The intruder would enter the property unarmed, locate the resident's own tools, an axe, a hatchet, or a razor, and utilize them for the assault. This protocol suggested a high degree of confidence in the layout of the victim's homes. The logic of the chisel also highlighted a specific temporal pattern. The breaches occurred between the hours of 12 a.m. and 3 a.m., typically on nights with high humidity and low wind, conditions that muffled the sound of prying wood. The July 1918 weather logs show a succession of such nights, yet the records for that month remain entirely blank. There are no reported attacks, no chiseled panels, and no recovered tools. This gap in the ledger, a 30-day period of absolute silence, remains unexplained in the official police narrative. The June files closed with the arrest of Louis Besumer on suspicion of being the Axeman, despite the lack of physical evidence linking him to the chiseled doors. While Besumer sat in a cell at the parish prison, the city's doors remained intact until the Schneider attack in August. The August 10th supplemental report for the Schneider case ends with an unresolved detail. During a secondary sweep of the Schneider kitchen, an officer moved a heavy cast-iron skillet that had been sitting on the stove. Underneath the skillet, resting on the coal burner, was a single silver shilling. The coin was dated 1894. Like the coin found at the Maggio grocery, it bore no connection to the household's finances. It was an artifact of another place, left in a room where the door had been chiseled open from the outside. The final entry for Chapter 2 notes that Anna Schneider survived her injuries but was unable to provide a description of her assailant. She claimed she had been asleep when the first blow fell and woke only to the sound of the back door clicking shut. The file on the tall man with the tool roll was opened, but the name column was left blank. The investigation into the August 1918 attacks was quickly subsumed by a secondary narrative preserved in the intelligence and subversion wing of the New Orleans Police Department archives. Following the attack on Louis Besumer and Harriet Lowe, the focus shifted from the mechanics of the chiseled door to the contents of Besumer's private drawers. In the heightened xenophobia of the Great War, the Besumer file transitioned from a homicide inquiry into a matter of national security. The ledger for June 1918 contains a detailed inventory of the items seized from the grocer's living quarters. Among the dry goods and accounting books, detectives recovered a small iron-bound trunk. Inside were letters written in German script and a series of technical diagrams. The initial field report, filed by Detective John D'Antonio, categorized these documents as suspicious and potentially tactical in nature. On June 24th, while Besumer was still recovering from his head injuries, he was placed under guard at Charity Hospital. The record of his first interrogation is brief. Besumer, a naturalized citizen who had lived in the United States for decades, maintained that the letters were from his family in Germany and the diagrams were related to the refrigeration units used in his grocery business. However, the Department of Justice's Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, requested a stay on his release. The narrative of espionage was fueled by the deteriorating condition and shifting testimony of Harriet Lowe. The medical log at Charity Hospital notes that Lowe's condition fluctuated between lucidity and delirium. On July 5th, she provided a formal deposition to the district attorney's office. According to the transcript, she claimed that Louis Besumer was not a grosser but a high-ranking German agent tasked with disrupting the flow of munitions from the New Orleans docks. Lowe's deposition took a more specific, forensic turn on July 10th. She stated that on the night of the attack, she had seen Besumer go to a hidden compartment in the wall to retrieve a large, heavy book written in a language she did not recognize. She claimed the attack was a staged event meant to cover the theft of sensitive documents. A secondary search of the Dorgenois Street property followed. The police report for July 12 states, structural inspection of the interior walls performed. No hidden compartments or voids detected. The large book described by Lowe was not recovered. Despite the lack of physical corroboration, the German spy angle was leaked to the local press. The Times-Picayune reported that a nest of traitors had been uncovered in the wake of the Axeman's blade. The archival trail then turns to the translation of the seized letters. The task was assigned to a local university professor, whose formal report is clipped to the back of the Besumer file. The professor's findings were as follows. The correspondence dated between 1914 and 1917 consists of inquiries regarding the health of a sister in Munich and the rising price of grain. There is no coded language or tactical terminology present. The diagrams represent an obsolete patent for a vegetable pressing machine. Despite this exoneration, Besumer remained in custody. The record shows he was indicted for the murder of Harriet Lowe after she succumbed to her injuries on August 5th. The same night, Anna Schneider was attacked. Across town, the Schneider attack introduced a logical fracture in the police department's theory. If Besumer was the Axeman and was currently incarcerated at the parish prison, the intruder at the Schneider residence required a new classification. The department's response, as noted in the August 7th memorandum, was to treat the Schneider case as a copycat or an unrelated domestic assault. However, the forensic comparison in the files argued otherwise. The removal of the door panel at the Schneider house matched the Maggio and Besumer breaches to within a fraction of an inch. The tool used the homeowner's own hatchet mirrored the Maggio and Besumer protocol of using found objects. The most disturbing entry in the Besumer file is a supplemental report from a night jailer at the parish prison. On the night of the Schneider attack, Besumer had allegedly spent the evening in a state of high agitation. The jailer's log for 2 a.m. reads, "Prisoner, Besumer pacing, he stated he could hear the sound of wood splitting. No such sound was audible in the block." The German spy allegation ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own lack of evidence. In early 1919, Besumer was brought to trial. The proceedings lasted only 10 minutes. The jury, presented with the clinical reality of the door panels and the total lack of espionage evidence, acquitted him. The Besumer file concludes with a single handwritten note by the presiding judge. It notes that while Besumer was legally cleared, His business had been ruined and his reputation permanently stained by the unsubstantiated claims of a dying woman. The final unresolved detail in this chapter of the archive involves the spy ledger Harriet Lowe described. In 1924, during a renovation of the old Besumer grocery, a workman discovered a small cavity beneath the floorboards of the back room. Inside was not a ledger of Germansecrets, but a collection of silver coins and a small, leather-bound notebook. The notebook did not contain codes. It contained a list of dates and addresses, including the Maggio residence and the Schneider residence, written in a hand that matched none of the suspects. Next to the date, May 23, 1918, was a single symbol, a small, hand-drawn shilling dot. As the 1918 investigation reached a stalemate, the New Orleans Police Department's record division was ordered to perform a retrospective search of the dead files. Unsolved homicides characterized by unusual methods of entry. The search was centered on a period 7 years prior. The objective, according to a memorandum dated September 14, 1918, was to determine if the Axeman was a new actor or a returning one. The 1911 files revealed a series of attacks that the department had previously classified as isolated incidents of Italian non-Italian violence, often attributed to the Black Hand or extortionist rings. However, when viewed through the clinical lens of the 1918 protocol, a mechanical pattern emerged that bypassed motive and focused entirely on the breach. The first relevant entry is dated May 14, 1911. The victims were Crudi and Rossetti, two grocers residing at 2137 Dauphine Street. The responding officer's report contains the following observation. A panel in the rear kitchen door had been chiseled out. The panel was discovered leaning against the cistern in the backyard. The victims had been struck with a cleaver while they slept. The cleaver, according to the inventory, belonged to the shop's own butcher block. The retrospective analysis of the 1911 spree identified 3 additional cases with identical markers. 1. June 1911. The attack on the Sciambras at 2500 Chartres Street. A rear door panel was chiseled out. A cleaver was used. No valuables were taken. Point 2. September 1911. The case of Tony Chambra. The record notes the intruder entered through a chiseled void in the door. The weapon was an axe found on the premises. 3. December 1911. The attack on the Davy family. The report explicitly mentions the neatness of the panel removal, noting that the chisel strokes indicated a steady hand and a lack of urgency. The 1911 file, however, contained a detail that the 1918 investigation had not yet encountered: the empty coin. In the Davy case, the lead investigator, Detective Rizzo, noted that while the family savings were left untouched in a cigar box, a single coin of silver Italian lira had been placed on the center of the kitchen table. It was not part of the household's currency. The comparison between 1911 and 1918 yielded a high degree of forensic overlap. The target profile was fixed: Italian grocers who lived in the same building as their place of business. The entry method was fixed: the chiseled-out door panel. The weapon choice was fixed: the homeowner's own tool. A psychological profile, though not formally named as such in the 1911 records, began to take shape in the margins of the file. The intruder was not a thief. The dead files ledger notes that in every 1911 instance, the cash registers were found closed and the victims' wallets were found undisturbed. The intruder's primary objective appeared to be the act of entry itself, the surgical removal of the panel followed by a swift, blunt force assault. The most troubling document in the 1911 archive is a witness statement from a young boy who lived across from the Sciambra residence. On the night of the June attack, he claimed he saw a man standing on the sidewalk under a street lamp. The man was not holding a weapon. He was holding a small piece of chalk and appeared to be writing on the pavement. When the 1918 detectives revisited the Dauphine Street site to look for this writing, 7 years of New Orleans rain and foot traffic had erased any physical evidence. However, a retired beat officer who had worked the 1911 cases provided a supplemental interview. He recalled a chalk marking outside the Davy residence that the original report had dismissed as juvenile graffiti. It was a simple, hand-drawn circle with a horizontal line through the center, a stylized representation of a coin. The 1911 precedents provided the department with a timeline, but they also introduced a systemic failure. The 1911 spree had ended as abruptly as it began, without an arrest. The perpetrator had simply ceased operations after the December attack on the Davy family. There was no record of the Axeman for 2,340 days. The 1918 file concludes its review of the 1911 precedents with a single, unanswered question in the detective's log. Where has the chisel been for 7 years? The investigation found no record of similar attacks in other cities during the intervening years. It was as if the intruder and his specific mechanical logic had been placed into cold storage. The final detail of Chapter 4 concerns a shipment of silver shillings. In 1912, following the cessation of the first spree, a local bank reported a discrepancy in its foreign currency exchange. A bag of silver shillings intended for a British merchant had been tampered with. The bag was not stolen, but when audited, it was found to contain several lead blanks. The weight was identical, but the currency had been replaced. The bank's internal report, now stapled to the 1911 NOPD file, noted that the replacement was so precise that it would only be noticed upon physical inspection of each individual coin. The archive from March 1919 documents a shift in the intruder's operational territory. For the first time, the logic of the chisel crossed the natural barrier of the Mississippi River. The target was the Cortimiglia residence in Gretna, a suburb on the West Bank. The geography of this attack presented a logistical anomaly that the New Orleans Police Department struggled to reconcile with the established suspect. Profiles. The record for March 10, 1919, details the discovery of the Cortimiglia family. Charles Cortimiglia, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary were found in their bedroom. Charles and Rosie had sustained severe cranial trauma. Mary was deceased. The coroner's report, Exhibit G14, specifies that the child was killed by a single blow from a heavy, blunt instrument while being held in her mother's arms. The physical entry followed the established protocol. The rear door panel of the Cortimiglia grocery had been removed with a chisel. The panel was found leaning against the back of the house, placed with the same clinical care noted in the Maggio and Besumer files. However, the Gretna Police Department's investigation introduced a variable that disrupted the previous year's theories. The time of the attack. The Mississippi River was at a seasonal high. The ferry service between New Orleans and Gretna was strictly monitored, and the river was patrolled by harbor police due to post-war shipping regulations. No unauthorized crossings were recorded between midnight and 4 a.m. This forced the investigation to look inward. Toward the immediate community of Gretna, the Gretna file centers on the accusation made by Rosie Cortimiglia upon regaining consciousness. In a state of extreme distress, she named her neighbors Orlando Giordano and his son Frank as the assailants. The Giordanos were rival grocers. The police ledger notes that Orlando was 69 years old and suffered from significant physical infirmity. Frank was described as of large build, but with no history of violence. The forensic evidence at the Cortimiglia residence, however, did not align with the accusation. The aperture in the door, the chiseled void, measured exactly 12 by 14 inches. A physical recreation, documented in the detective's log, determined that neither Orlando nor the broad-shouldered Frank could have passed through the opening without structural damage to the surrounding frame. The wood showed no such damage. Furthermore, the weapon used in the attack, a large axe, was recovered from the Cortimiglia's own back porch. It was found in a bucket of water, as if the intruder had attempted to clean the blade before departing. The records show that the Giordano's own tools were inspected. They were dry, dusty, and showed no signs of recent use or cleaning. Despite these mechanical inconsistencies, the Giordanos were arrested. The trial record for the state of Louisiana v. Giordano is a study in procedural irregularity. Rosie Cortimiglia's testimony was the sole evidence. When the defense attorney pointed out the impossibility of the elder Giordano fitting through the chiseled panel, the prosecution argued that they may have aided an unnamed third party. The jury returned a verdict of guilty. Orlando was sentenced to life. Frank was sentenced to hang. The Gretna file contains a secondary, smaller folder labeled "Evidence Withheld." Inside is a report from a Gretna night watchman who had been patrolling the tracks of the Texas and Pacific Railroad, which ran behind the Cortimiglia store. On the night of the attack at 3:15 a.m., he reported seeing a man walking along the tracks toward the river. The man was tall and thin, wearing a light-colored suit that seemed out of place for the weather. The watchman noted that the man was carrying a small, wooden box similar to a luthier's case or a tool kit. The most chilling entry in the Gretna ledger is the inventory of the Cortimiglia kitchen. On the morning of the investigation, an officer noted that a single chair had been pulled out from the table and placed to face the bedroom door. On the seat of the chair lay a silver shilling. This coin was dated 1918. It was the same denomination and era as the coins found at the Maggio and Schneider residences on the opposite side of the river. The presence of the shilling in Gretna suggested that the river had not been a barrier, but merely a transit point. The Gretna file remains unresolved in its internal logic. The Giordanos were in custody, yet the mechanical signature of the crime, the precise removal of the wood, the use of the found axe, and the placement of the foreign coin suggested an intruder who functioned with a level of surgical detachment that the elderly Orlando and his son did not possess. The chapter ends with a note on the Cortimiglia's dog. Neighbors reported that the animal, a large guard dog, had not barked once during the night. The police record notes that the dog was found in the backyard sitting quietly by the chiseled outdoor panel. It showed no signs of injury or sedation. It simply watched the officers as they removed the evidence. The archival focus of March 1919 shifts from the physical mechanics of the crime scene to a single piece of correspondence. On March 13, 1919, the editorial offices of the Times-Picayune received a letter that was subsequently handed over to the New Orleans Police Department. The document was entered into the evidence locker as item 77B, unlike previous communications in criminal files. This was not a ransom note or a confession, but a manifesto of intent. The letter was postmarked from the Upper Line station. The handwriting was described by the department's graphologist as fluid, elegant, and demonstrating a high degree of calligraphic control, which contrasted sharply with the crude chalk messages found on the pavement of the Maggio residence. The transcript, preserved in the NOPD central file, begins with a formal salutation. Hell, March 13, 1919. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. The record notes a specific linguistic anomaly in the text. The writer utilizes a vocabulary that is entirely inconsistent with the suspects currently in custody. Words such as ether, astral, and Tartarus appear in the margins of the prose. The investigator's log for March 14th contains a query regarding the educational background of the Giordanos and Louis Besumer. None of the men were found to have any familiarity with classical mythology or theosophical terminology. The document continues with a specific, time-bound directive that would dictate the city's behavior for the following. Tuesday night. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose house a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it up on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. The police department's analysis of the letter was clinical. They noted that the Axeman claimed responsibility for the 1911 attacks, referring to them as his previous visit. However, the most vital forensic detail was not in Theward's but in the paper itself. The paper was a high-grade vellum, typically used by architectural firms or legal practices. When held to the light, the watermark revealed a local supplier on Camp Street. The records of that supplier were checked, but the paper was a common stock sold to hundreds of businesses in the central business district. There were no fingerprints on the sheet. The record indicates it had been handled with gloves or wiped clean with a solvent. A secondary detail in the letter, often overlooked in public accounts, is the mention of the shilling of the gate. The writer stated, I leave my calling card not for the living, but for the ledger. This corresponds directly with the silver coins recovered from the Maggio, Schneider, and Cortimiglia crime scenes items that had not yet been disclosed to the press. The presence of this detail in the letter confirmed its authenticity to the investigators. The NOPD's internal memorandum regarding the letter suggests a conflict in the perpetrator's persona. The logic of Chisel used in the attacks was the work of a laborer, someone comfortable with heavy tools and structural weaknesses. The letter, conversely, was the work of an intellectual or a musician, someone who viewed the murders as a rhythmic performance rather than a criminal enterprise. The file for March 15 records a surge in the purchase of sheet music and the tuning of pianos across the city. The police department did not officially endorse the letter's jazz requirement, but the ledger shows that patrol frequency was doubled in the Italian quarters. The most peculiar entry in Chapter 6 is the record of a local composer, Joseph John Davila, who quickly penned a piece titled The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa. The police file contains a copy of the sheet music. On the cover, the illustrator depicted a family at a piano, their eyes fixed on a chiseled-out door panel in the background. The chapter concludes with a record of the silence at the Gretna jail. Frank and Orlando Giordano, upon being told of the letter, reportedly showed no recognition of the terms used. Frank Giordano's only recorded comment, preserved in the jailer's log, was, "I do not know what Tartarus is. I only know the price of flour." The letter had set a deadline, Tuesday night, March 18th, 1919. The city's survival was now predicated on a mandate of sound. The archival record for the night of March 18th, 1919, is characterized by an unprecedented density of auditory data. In the history of the New Orleans Police Department, there is no other 24-hour window where the city's soundscape was so thoroughly documented by patrol officers. The syncopated shield refers to the citywide implementation of the Axeman's musical mandate, a phenomenon that effectively paralyzed the criminal investigative process for the duration of the night. The police log for 8 p.m. on March 18 notes that the usual ambient noise of the city, the low hum of the docks, and the distant clatter of the streetcars was replaced by a cacophony of disparate rhythms from the mansions of St. Charles Avenue to the tenements of the French Quarter. The records show that phonographs, player pianos, and live ensembles were engaged at maximum volume. The NOPD's tactical plan for the night was to maintain a presence on the streets while monitoring for the specific sound of the chisel. However, the departmental memorandum filed the next morning, March 19th, admits to a total failure of acoustic surveillance. The jazz requirement had created a wall of sound that rendered the physical detection of a break-in impossible. Officer J. Callery wrote in his field report, "The volume of the music in the 3rd Precinct was such that a door could have been removed with a sledgehammer and remained unheard by a man standing on the sidewalk." The archival file contains a fascinating subledger of proximity reports. These were statements from individuals who claimed to have seen the intruder during the night of the 18th, 11:30 p.m., St. Peter Street. A witness reported a man in a dark overcoat standing motionless in the middle of the street, seemingly conducting the music from the nearby bars with a small metallic object in his hand. 1:15 a.m., Girard Street. A patrolman reported finding a rear door panel already chiseled out of a vacant warehouse. Upon entering, the building was found empty. On a crate in the center of the room sat a portable gramophone, its spring wound tight, but the needle retracted, despite the fear. The record for the morning of March 19th shows a significant statistical anomaly. There were no murders. The police blotter, which usually recorded dozens of minor and major offenses on a Tuesday night, remained almost entirely blank. The city had complied with the demon's directive, and the demon had in turn remained dormant. However, the syncopated shield file concludes with a discovery made at 6 a.m. on March 19th at the corner of South Rampart and Perdidos streets. A street sweeper found a pile of discarded items in the gutter. The inventory of these items, preserved in the NOPD evidence locker as Exhibit 102D, included to one carpenter's chisel, brand new, with no owner's marks. 2, a leather tool roll containing various bits and braces. 3, a small, velvet-lined box. The box was empty, save for a thin layer of metallic dust. A subsequent lab analysis primitive by modern standards identified The dust as a mixture of silver and lead. The archival record for this day also includes a curious note from the municipal power plant. During the peak of the jazz performances between 12 a.m. and 2 a.m., the city's electrical grid experienced a series of unexplained surges in the Italian districts. The surges did not correspond with increased lighting use. They were localized to the specific blocks where the 1911 and 1918 attacks had occurred. The engineering report suggests a grounding issue, but the specific cause was never identified. The most chilling entry in Chapter 7 is a secondary report from the parish morgue. On the night of March 18th, while the city played jazz to save the living, the morgue was broken into. Nothing was stolen. No bodies were disturbed. The only evidence of the intrusion was the rear door, where a lower panel had been neatly removed with a chisel and placed on the steps. Beside the removed panel lay a single silver shilling. Dated 1894, the night of the syncopated shield is officially recorded as a success by the municipal authorities, as no lives were lost. However, the archival distance of the file suggests a different conclusion. The city had entered into a contract with the intruder, and in doing so, had acknowledged a power that the police could not counter. The Axeman had moved from a physical threat to a regulatory force. The file for the remainder of March 1919 shows a slow return to silence. The jazz band stopped playing, the doors were reinforced with iron plating, and the city waited for the next entry in the ledger, the archival record for October 27, 1919. Documents the final confirmed entry of the logic of the chisel. The event took place at 427 Scott Street, the residence of Mike Pepitone, a grocer and father of 6. The Pepitone file is characterized by a lack of the usual forensic ambiguity. It is the most direct and violent encounter preserved in the 1919 ledger. At approximately 1 a.m., Esther Pepitone was awakened by the sound of rhythmic striking. According to her deposition, taken 3 hours later at the 2nd precinct, she hurried to the bedroom door and observed a tall, heavy-set man standing over her husband's bed. The intruder was holding a large axe. The physical inspection of the scene, performed by Detective John D'Antonio, confirmed the mechanical protocol. The rear door leading into the kitchen had been breached. The lower panel had been chiseled out with the same precise strokes noted in the Maggio and Cortimiglia cases. The panel was found resting against the kitchen stove. The axe used in the assault was recovered from the courtyard. It belonged to the Pepitone household and had been taken from the woodpile near the cistern. The medical examiner's report for Mike Pepitone describes 18 distinct strikes to the head and upper torso. The force of the attack was so significant that the headboard of the bed had been splintered. Despite this violence, the room remained otherwise undisturbed. The inventory of the bedroom notes that a gold watch and a wallet containing $100 remained on the dresser. The intruder had not come for currency. Esther Pepitone's description of the assailant introduced a new variable into the record. Unlike previous witness accounts that described a tall, shadowy figure or a thin man in a suit, she described a man of immense proportions, wearing a dark flannel shirt and no hat. She claimed that as she entered the room, the man stepped toward the open window, looked directly at her, and leaped into the darkness of the yard. The file for the Pepitone investigation includes a significant forensic recovery from the courtyard. In the soft mud beneath the bedroom window, officers discovered a single, deep footprint. The impression was from a heavy work boot. The length of the print was measured at 13 inches. However, The police log notes a secondary detail. The footprint was oriented as if the person were facing the house, not fleeing from it. Following the Pepitone homicide, the investigation returned to the logic of the chisel. The chisel used to remove the door panel was found abandoned on the kitchen table. It was a 1.5-inch carpenter's tool. Upon inspection, the police discovered a name etched into the wooden handle, J. Mumford. A search of the NOPD's internal database, the Rogues Gallery, yielded multiple matches for the name Mumford or Monfort. The most prominent was Joseph Mumford, a man with a criminal history involving burglary and assault. The record shows that Mumford had a specific history with the Italian community in New Orleans. More importantly, the archival timeline revealed a striking correlation. Mumford had been incarcerated in the state penitentiary during the years of silence between the 1911 and 1918 sprees. The Pepitone file contains a supplemental note regarding the citywide reaction to the October 27th attack. Unlike the jazz-fueled night of March 18th, there was no music. The city had remained silent, and the axeman had returned to the chiseled door. The failure of the syncopated shield to provide long-term protection resulted in a mass exodus of Italian grocers from the city. The October 30th ledger of the New Orleans Board of Trade shows that 24 grocery businesses were listed for sale. In a single day, the final entry in the Pepitone crime scene log is a detail regarding the kitchen table. Next to the abandoned chisel sat a single silver shilling. This coin was dated 1894. It had been placed directly on top of a small, hand-drawn circle on the tablecloth. Sketched in charcoal, the Pepitone homicide remains the final active case in the Axeman ledger. After October 27, 1919, the records of chiseled door panels and abandoned axes in New Orleans cease entirely. The intruder's departure from the city was as unrecorded as his arrival. The file for Chapter 8 ends with a transcript of Esther Pepitone's final statement to the press before she left for Los Angeles. She did not speak of fear or tragedy. She spoke only of the door. "He didn't break in," she stated. "He took the door apart. He was a builder who came to tear us down." The archival focus shifts across the continent to December 1920, the record for the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, specifically the precinct covering the West Adams District, contains an entry for a shooting that occurred on a sidewalk in broad daylight. The file, subsequently linked to the New Orleans Axeman ledger through a formal request for information by the NOPD, documents the intersection of Joseph Mumford and the widow Esther Pepitone. The report, dated December 5, 1920, states that a man identified as Joseph Mumford, alias Monfort, was approached by a woman in a heavy black veil. According to 3 civilian witnesses, the woman produced a revolver and fired several rounds at close range. Mumford collapsed on the pavement. The inventory of his effects at the time of his death included a leather tool roll, a set of high-grade carpenter's chisels, and approximately $500 in cash. Esther Pepitone was apprehended at the scene. The transcript of her initial statement, preserved in the Los Angeles County Archive, is notable for its clinical lack of remorse. She did not describe the act as a crime of passion. She described it as a necessary closure of the file. According to the record, she told the arresting officers, "He was the man from the window on Scott Street. I have been following the Shillings." The LAPD investigation into Joseph Mumford's recent history revealed a pattern of mobility that mirrored the gaps in the New Orleans records. Mumford had a criminal history dating back to 1910. The prison ledger for the Louisiana State Penitentiary shows that Mumford was incarcerated from 1911 to 1918, the exact duration of the Axeman's 7-year silence. He was released in early 1918. Weeks before the Maggio attack, the Los Angeles file includes a secondary search of Mumford's rented room. The responding detectives recovered several items that were subsequently photographed and sent to New Orleans for identification. 1. A white chalk stick, worn down to a nub. 2. A collection of silver coins of various international origins, including 5 silver shillings dated between 1890 and 1918.3. A map of the New Orleans streetcar system with specific grocery store locations circled in red. Despite these physical links, the NOPD's supplemental report, filed in January 1921, expresses a degree of forensic skepticism. While the timeline of Mumford's incarceration aligned with the spree's cessation, the physical description provided by earlier witnesses, specifically the tall, thin man in a light suit, did not match Mumford's immense and heavy-set build. The record suggests the possibility of multiple actors or a discrepancy in witness perception. The Los Angeles court records show that Esther Pepitone was charged with murder. However, the trial did not proceed to a conventional conclusion. The file contains a memorandum of release dated March 1921. The justification for the dismissal of charges remains redacted in the official ledger, though a handwritten marginal note by the clerk mentions unspecified pressure from New Orleans municipal interests. The most unsettling detail in the Mumford file concerns the autopsy. The medical examiner in Los Angeles noted a series of surgical scars on Mumford's hands and forearms. These were not the result of accidents, but deliberate, patterned incisions that had healed over decades. The patterns, when sketched, bore a geometric resemblance to the chalk symbols found on the sidewalks of New Orleans, the gate, and the coin. The Los Angeles altercation is often cited in popular history as the end of the Axeman, but the archival record remains open. The LAPD file concludes with a report of a missing item from the evidence locker. On the night following Mumford's death, the silver shillings recovered from his room vanished. There was no sign of a break-in at the station. The final note in Chapter 9 is a brief report from the New Orleans harbor master. Dated April 1921, a small wooden crate was found floating near the Upper Line Street docks. Inside was a single high-gauge carpenter's chisel and a note written on vellum. The note contained no words, only a series of numbers that corresponded to the dates of the 1911 and 1918 murders. The crate was empty of anything else, save for a layer of silt from the riverbed. The final entry in the Axeman archive, dated June 1922, is not a report of a capture but a summary of residual anomalies. In the 3 years following the Pepitone homicide and the subsequent death of Joseph Mumford in California, the New Orleans Police Department attempted to formalize the closure of the files. However, the ledger remains technically open, categorized under status unresolved. The archival summary begins with a census of the physical evidence currently held in the municipal basement. The inventory is as follows: 14 chiseled door panels, 7 axes, 5 with traces of organic residue, 1 bone-white straight razor, 1 leather tool roll recovered from Los Angeles, 0 silver shillings, the disappearance of the coins from the evidence, Lockers both in New Orleans and Los Angeles is noted without explanation in the final procedural audit. The record simply states, currency inventory unable to be verified at time of transfer. The unclosed door file also contains a retrospective on the victims. A statistical analysis of the spree reveals a 90% correlation between the targets and the Italian grocery trade. Yet the motive of extortion, frequently cited in early reports, is systematically debunked in the final summary. The ledger notes that in none of the cases were the victims approached for protection money prior to the attacks, nor were their financial assets touched after the breach. The motive, the archive suggests, was the act of the aperture itself, the mechanical triumph over the locked door. There is a final, peculiar entry in the 1922 ledger regarding the chalk inscriptions. While the physical writing on the pavements of New Orleans had long since faded, a city surveyor working in the French Quarter reported a series of recurring marks on the foundations of buildings that had been renovated after 1919. The marks were not on the surface but etched into the brickwork beneath the plaster. They consisted of a single vertical line crossed by a circle. The most unsettling document in the concluding chapter is a letter from the New Orleans Bureau of Vital Statistics. In 1921, an audit of the mortality registers for the year 1911, the year of the first spree, was performed. The auditor discovered a discrepancy in the Mrs. Tony reference from the Maggio chalk message. While no Mrs. Tony had been murdered in 1911, the record showed a Mrs. Tony who had been a witness in a 1911 burglary trial involving a stolen chisel. She had disappeared 3 days after her testimony. Her file was never marked as a homicide. It was simply left blank. The archive concludes with a clinical observation of the city's architecture. Following 1919, the New Orleans grocery design underwent a structural shift. The traditional wooden rear doors were largely replaced with solid steel or reinforced iron. The use of the lower wooden panel, the Axeman's aperture, was discontinued in new constructions. The final page of the ledger, dated December 31, 1922, contains no text. It consists only of a photograph of the rear door of the Maggio residence, taken 4 years after the crime. The void where the panel had been removed was boarded up with mismatched cypress planks. On the center plank, barely visible in the grain of the wood, is the faint, indented circular mark of a coin that had been pressed into the timber with immense force and then removed. The record for 1918 to 1919 is hereby moved to the inactive vault. The doors are locked, though the integrity of the panels remains unverified. The archive is now complete. No further entries are recorded in the official ledger.